This is the last day of the Theodore Roosevelt Institute at LIU's conference. We've had terrific sessions. We're always delighted to see the students here, both from LIU and also from high school. So I think we have a very good session that will interest all of you today, particularly the young, because it's focusing on media. And media is a big deal, and it's a big deal right now. I'm very pleased to have Todd Brewster here, who is a professor at various places, Mount Holyoke and others, and has had a long career in media, all kinds of different institutions that he's worked for. And of course, he'll be talking about media, TR, media in general, and whatever else he wants to talk about. So come on up, Todd.
Thank you, Tweed, and I'm delighted to be here. There aren't many of you out there, but I hope you'll all listen very intently so we have some good questions and answers at the end of the session. I will note that Tweed didn't mention this. I am actually a professor of practice at Mount Holyoke College, which means I am a working journalist, have been working journalist for 40 years, working both in magazines and in television and in digital media. I worked at ABC News as a senior producer, and before that as a writer and editor at Time. So I've been both a journalist and I've taught journalism, and I'm lecturing to you today about journalism, so I hope you'll feel that you're hearing a voice of authority. The picture up here, I'll just explain it a little bit before we get started. It's the logo here of the New Republic magazine. How many of you have heard of New Republic before? Good. So it's still in existence. It's been in existence over 100 years now. But back in the time of TR, it was one of the principal journalism outlets, and magazines were really big then. Unlike today, when we have our move into digital media and social media, back then magazines were the cutting edge of communications media. At the top there, you'll see a few photographs of key people. The one I want you to focus on most is the third guy from the left, who is Walter Lippmann. He was a very famous journalist of the time, and actually going forward from TR all the way to the 1960s and 70s, but kind of the conscience of the nation, a very important columnist and thinker. And we're going to focus on a lot of his particularly interesting thought. The magazine over the upper right-hand corner is McClure's, which was the other principal magazine that sort of helped to sort of stir the intellectual dialogue about major issues of the time, both in terms of the progressive era and also in terms of democracy itself, as we'll see in what I'm about to talk to you about. Ray Standard Baker, a writer there, Ida Tarbell on the far right, writer there, and then I won't tell you who the guy on the far left is, some guy with a mustache, that's all I know. Teddy Roosevelt once called the journalist Walter Lippmann the most brilliant young mind of his age in the United States. That's Whitman on the third from the left, as I said. Towards the end of his long and influential career, Lippmann, who lived to the 1970s, long enough to see Watergate, recalled that while he had known 12 presidents personally, including Wilson, FDR, Kennedy, and Johnson, only one, he said, was lovable, Teddy Roosevelt. And I loved him, he said. For Lippmann, it was a fascination born from the enthusiasm of a child. As an 8-year-old, he had been so captivated by the story of San Juan Hill, he regarded TR as a hero and himself as a hero worshiper. Lippmann was still a youth during TR's presidency. He didn't graduate from Harvard until 2010, more than a year after Roosevelt left office. But even during this time, people who knew Lippmann knew that he continued to be a fan of TR, and that Lippmann, too, was a special man, and he, too, was headed for greatness. One day, impressed by something the young Lippmann had written, William James, the great philosopher and psychologist, brother of Henry James, the writer, knocked on Lippmann's college room door. A friendship ensued, animated by weekly meetings when James and Lippmann would stroll around campus together, discussing philosophy and politics. It was, Lippmann later said, the greatest thing that had happened to him in his college life. By the time that Lippmann's first book, A Preface to Politics, was published in 1913, he was already captivating the attention of the intellectual class. And indeed, that volume contains some prescient insights, chief among them a kind of suspicion of political motives and a cynicism about how the popular will could be swayed in a democracy. Once you touch the biographies of human beings, Lippmann wrote, the notion that political beliefs are logically determined collapses like a pricked balloon. Men desire first, then they reason. Fascinated by the future, they invent a scientific socialism to get them there. It is true that statecraft must make human nature its basis. It is true that its chief task is the invention of forms and institutions which satisfy the inner needs of mankind. And it is true that our knowledge of those needs and the technique of their satisfaction is hazy, unorganized, and blundering. And here's what Lippmann wrote about Teddy Roosevelt in that same volume. Government under him was a throbbing human purpose. He succeeded where Taft had failed in preventing that drought of invention which officialism brings. Crude, of course he was crude. He had a hemisphere for his canvas. Inconsistent, yes. Excuse me, he tried to be the leader of factions at war with one another. A late convert, he's a statesman and not an agitator. His business was to meet demands when they had grown to national proportions. He has said some silly things. He has not been subtle, and he has been far from perfect. But his success should be judged by the size of his task, by the fierceness of the opposition, by the intellectual qualities of the nation he represented. When we remember that he was trained in the Republican politics by Hanna and Platt, that he was the first president who shared a new social vision, then I believe we need to offer no apologies for making Mr. Roosevelt stand as the working class model for an American statesman at the beginning of the 20th century. Pretty high praise. And then there's finally this one. And remember this next one as we go forward in this talk towards the elements of democracy. Whitman wrote, "It isn't sentimentality which says that where there is no vision, the people perish. Every time Tammany Hall was the political machine in New York City at the time, sets off fireworks and oratory on the 4th of July, every time the picture of Lincoln is displayed at a political convention, every red bandana of the progressives and the red flag of the socialists, every song from the Battle Hymn of the Republic to the Internationale, every metrical conclusion to a great speech, whether we stand at Armageddon, refuse to press upon the brow of labor another crown of thorns, or call upon the workers of the world to unite." Those are all phrases from speeches given in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Every one of these slogans is an incitement to the will, an effort to energize politics. They are attempts to harness blind impulses to particular purposes. They are tributes to the sound, practical sense of a vision of politics. No cause can succeed without them, but those who intend to rely upon an efficiency of a scientific method, a demonstration and logical proof, can hold their conventions in anybody's back parlor and have room to spare. I think the important thing to realize about that particular quote is how Lippmann already understood that politics, as we understand it in our own time, is driven by symbols, and particularly how that can dilute and decay democracy. Roosevelt found a kind of kindred spirit in Lippmann, as he did with the other writers of the freshly formed New Republic magazine. Shortly after the 1912 election, he had invited Lippmann and Herbert Crowley, the magazine's editor, to lunch. Having lost the election to Woodrow Wilson, he felt that the New Republic was in a position to carry the torch for him. For as long as there was fighting on the Western Front, Roosevelt was content to assume the role of agitated columnist, working first for the Kansas City Star and later for Metropolitan magazine. So Roosevelt himself was something of a journalist in his post-presidency years. And so he urged those whom he regarded as more scholarly than he, that would be Lippmann and Herbert Crowley and others, to continue to lead the parade for progressivism while he railed against pacifism, urged preparedness for the war, and charged cowardice to the leaders who wished to stay out of Europe's squabbles. Eventually, the war would come between them. The New Republic writers were more cautious and opposed U.S. intervention in the war until very late. And Roosevelt, feeling abandoned, resented them for their position. This was the martial-spirited TR, who called Wilson an abject coward and accused the American people of lacking honor for their unwillingness to support a foreign war. The TR who argued that the German language classes should end and that opposition to the war was nothing less than sedition, treason. Indeed, by 1918, a year before his death, TR was describing those same editors of the New Republic, the ones who he'd been so close to, Lippmann and Crowley and Walter Wheel, as degenerates, and the publication itself as no better than the trashy Hearst papers, the yellow journalism of the late 19th century. The difference, he said, was merely one of manner. But that was the cantankerous TR, isolated in his last years. If instead we examined the full sweep of Roosevelt's career, one would have to say that he valued deeply his relationship with journalists. TR certainly owed a lot to them, and they owed a lot to TR. They'd gone running up San Juan Hill with him, not only reporters, but photographers, too, building the legend of TR. Then once he assumed the presidency, they became crucial vehicles through which to convey his message. After all, this was a time when there was no Twitter. Oh my God, the presidency without Twitter. How did it function? Well, for there to be a bully poet, someone needed to be there to record the bullying. And Roosevelt knew the value of good ink. So he cultivated reporters like Ida Tarbell, Lincoln Steffens, Ray Stannard Baker, all writers for McClure's. It was a happy marriage. For if this was a new era of politics, it was also a new era of journalism. Journalists no longer just recorded what happened. They made things happen. They opened doors, looked under the carpet, emptied cabinets, and otherwise looked for the underlying reasons for why things were the way they were and how they could be better. They raised the veil on abuses in the workplace and in the mental hospitals and at City Hall. Lincoln Steffens uncovered a Boss Tweed-style political corruption scandal in St. Louis. Ray Stannard Baker wrote of terrible conditions endured by workers in the coal mines. Samuel Adams exposed the fraudulent business of patent medicines. And in a 19-part series in McClure's, Ida Tarbell revealed how John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil was rigging prices and destroying the competition in violation of the Sherman Antitrust Act. Roosevelt gave them the moniker of muckraker. He took it from a passage in Pilgrim's Progress, a man who could look no way but downward with the muck rake in his hands. He meant it as an insult, of course, as if all you could do was rake the muck, blind to the achievements and successes of good government. Muckraker as a term was the ancestor to the nattering nabobs of negativism that Bill Sapphire wrote into a speech for Spiro Agnew in 1973 when the Nixon administration was under fire. But the original muckrakers adopted the name as a badge of honor. And truth be told, these men and women did much more than rake muck. Investigative journalism had first appeared in the late 19th century. But what distinguished the men and women of McClure's and others in the time of TR was that despite Roosevelt's criticism, these journalists were in fact reformists themselves. They did not uncover abuse for the sake of sensationalism. They did not bend facts and distort truths for the sake of selling newspapers. This was journalism as it had never been done before. The muckrakers were addressing the hard conditions of so many of their countrymen, unsafe working conditions, predatory business practices, public servants corrupting the public trust. At root was the appeal of professionalism, of good, sound government addressing the ills of society. A respect for expertise permeated the society at the time. William Allen White remarked that during this time it was as if we had government by magazine. Consider the consequences of their work. Tarbell's series on Standard Oil led to the breakup of that monopoly and to the Clayton Antitrust Act and the establishment of the Federal Trade Commission. Steffens' exposure of municipal corruption in St. Louis, collected into a book called The Shame of the Cities, helped lead the district attorney there, Joe Folk, to indictment of local politicians and a reevaluation of the extent of municipal corruption nationwide. The novels of Upton Sinclair, journalism masquerading as fiction, exposed the meatpacking industry's inhuman labor practices and unsanitary conditions and led to the adoption of the Pure Food and Drug Act. Jack London called it the Uncle Tom's Cabin of wage slavery. After Tarbell and Steffens and Baker left McClure's to form the American magazine in 1908, Baker, reporting on the riots in Atlanta, became one of the first journalists to address race issues. An eventual supporter of Wilson, he was sent to Europe to engage in the post-World War I diplomacy and became Wilson's press secretary at Versailles. It is hardly an exaggeration to say that the progressive mind was characteristically a journalistic mind, the historian Richard Hofstadter wrote. And in this characteristic contribution was that of the socially responsible reporter reformer, because before there could be action, there needed to be information and exhortation. Indeed, at the end of her detailed exposure of Standard Oil, Tarbell framed her conclusion by challenging the public to take action. What are we going to do about it, she wrote. For it is our business, we, the people of the United States, and nobody else, must cure whatever is wrong in the industrial situation. These appeals to reform were significant not only because they came from sound, detailed reporting, but because they were read beyond Washington and New York, beyond the governing and activist classes. They were read by the great multitudes. Up until roughly the time of TR, the American magazine had, with few exceptions, been confined to popular fiction, fashion, and housekeeping. McClure's and eventually the New Republic took the genre into a completely new direction. Unlike newspapers, which continued to be local, the magazine developed a national scope of circulation. This is a time before radio, before television, before the internet, of course, a time when magazines were the first statement of a national popular culture that would grow to the behemoth we have today. Newer, faster printing techniques aided this passage. When Ida Tarbell started working at McClure's in 1894, the circulation of the magazine was roughly 50,000. After her first big series, it had doubled. By 1900, it was 370,000, and deep into running its muckraking specials, it had topped 500,000. Magazines were spurring a national conversation about reform. Among the journalists of the time, Lippmann was an outlier. Unlike them, he was reluctant to blame the problems of society on industrial concentration. To him, the answer was more public control, not simply breaking of the powerful in order to return to a richer, competitive society. On this, he and TR found common ground. But something else preoccupied him, and he revealed it in two books that he published consecutively in 1920 and 1922. Liberty and the News was the first one, and Public Opinion was the second. It was already a different time. Roosevelt was gone. Wilson was sitting with Ray Stannard Baker as the writer worked on a 3-volume definitive biography of him. He would die 2 years later. The corrupt Harding administration was undoing the progressive era step by step. Silent Cal Coolidge was about to succeed Harding upon the latter man's death in the summer of 1923. It would be an understatement to say that this was not the uplifting moment that occurred during the progressive age's heyday under TR. And now, witnessing a time when his hero no longer cast a shadow across the firmament, Lippmann wrote pessimistically about democracy. The American founders had established a system that was democratic in spirit, but fortified by anti-democratic restrictions intended to put the reins on public will. Only property holders could vote. Only men, only white men of a certain age. In the nation's most important election, the quadrennial vote for president, the House of Representatives, working through the Electoral College, would hold a final check on the popular will. But by 1920, much of that had changed. America was a more democratic nation. In a sweep of roughly 75 years or so, the nation had separated property from voting rights. The last state to abolish property qualification was North Carolina in 1856. Recognized African American citizenship and voting rights through the Civil War amendments, even if that vote was to be largely suppressed for another 100 years. Allowed for the popular election of senators until the 17th Amendment was ratified in 1913. These were chosen by state legislatures. And in 1920, granted the right to vote to women. All of that, Lippmann argued, put much more power in the hands of the public. Sovereignty had shifted from the legislature to public opinion. And that, he said, made journalism as the go-between, the explainer, so much more important. But what did the people know? What could they possibly know? Could they be trusted to make decisions? What each man does is based not on direct and certain knowledge, but on pictures made by himself or given to him, he wrote. When the founders wrote the First Amendment guaranteeing freedom of speech and freedom of the press, they were concerned about releasing the mind and the voice from oppression. But it's unclear whether they had also anticipated the role of a press as the motivator for public opinion. TR and the muckrakers had appealed to the people to get on board with progressivism because popular will had become essential to politics. But they had only limited success, and much of that spirit vanished with the 26th president. If the swell of popular will pushed by good government advocates like the muckrakers had succeeded under TR, who could assure that it would always do so? It was, Lippmann's writings, the first critique of mass communication. For Lippmann argued that the forces working to shape public will were not earnest, well-meaning purveyors of fact and opinion, fact and wisdom, that is, but masters of the new arts of advertising and public relations, and the result was not some clear vision of the one best way, to borrow a phrase from the efficiency expert Frederick Winslow Taylor, another icon of the progressive era, but the manufacture of consent for one often lowly purpose or another. Whitman's solution was an impractical one at best, that an expert class should be formed that could feed journalists the solutions to complex problems, and the journalists would then explain them to the public. But the underlying message was harder to contemplate, that democracy was not a fit form of government for the modern age, that it got corrupted like a bug in the ointment in the machinery of modern communications. It was always a challenging thought in a system of government that relied on popular will. Could the people be trusted? Or would they become victim to this shiny object or that one, and the need to reduce the big questions of governing to something that can fit into their lives? Again, from Roosevelt, as I quoted earlier, the average voter usually sees what he is voting about in a very simple form. He does not regard the political picture as an etching and follow out the delicate tracery. He treats it as a circus poster in which the colors are in very vivid contrast and are laid on with a broad brush. In the end, Lippmann thought citizens were like theatergoers who arrived in the middle of the third act and leave before the last curtain, staying just long enough to decide who is the hero and who is the villain. In a letter to the editor of The Atlantic magazine, written shortly before he issued the first of these books, Lippmann wrote, "I have started to write a longish article around the general idea that freedom of thought and speech present themselves in a new light and raise new problems because of the discovery that opinion can be manufactured." He went on, "When political parties or newspapers declare for Americanism, progressivism, law and order, justice, humanity, they hope to amalgamate the emotion of conflicting factions which would surely divide if, instead of these symbols, they were invited to discuss a specific program. For when a coalition around the symbol has been affected, feeling flows toward conformity under the symbol rather than toward critical scrutiny of the measures. It is, I think, convenient and technically correct to call multiple phrases like these symbolic. They do not stand for specific ideas, but for a sort of truce or junction between ideas. They are like a strategic railroad center where many roads converge regardless of their ultimate origin or their ultimate destination. But he who captures the symbols by which public feeling is for the moment contained controls by that much the approaches of public policy. And as long as a particular symbol has the power of coalition, ambitious factions will fight for possession. Think," he continued, "for example, of Lincoln's name or Roosevelt's. A leader or an interest that can make itself master of current symbols is the master of the current situation. There are limits, of course. Too violent abuse of the actualities which groups of people think the symbol represents, or too great resistance in the name of that symbol to new purposes, will, so to speak, burst the symbol. In this manner, during the year 1917, the imposing symbol of Holy Russia and the Little Father burst upon the impact of suffering and defeat." But how prescient. For, of course, I think of our own era, with a politics that sends us careening from one image to another, with leaders who create phantom fears, awaken old prejudices, and stir resentments. Those of you who know the story of Roosevelt and Lippmann will recall that a voice emerged to challenge the journalist's critique of democracy. It came from a man named John Dewey, who suggested that Lippmann had gotten it all wrong. He called Whitman's public opinion the most effective indictment of democracy ever penned, but Dewey was not as pessimistic. The goal of democracy, he said, was not simply to conduct public acts. It was to make it possible for people to realize their fullest potential as unique representatives of the human form. It was true, he said, that the public could never be in a position to make decisions on the complex problems of the modern world, but democracy did not depend alone on that one transaction. Dewey asserted that if people were free, if freedom of speech, press, and expression meant that they could communicate freely with one another, democracy would be the inevitable result. 100 years later, this debate, like so many that lie at the center of our identity as Americans, is still with us. Indeed, it is the core of the problem now facing our turbulent journalism profession. Will the demise of a centralized press, the one that Lippmann and most professional classes preferred, and the rise of a new decentralized crowd of voices populating the internet and social media mean the end of our experiment or the beginning of a new phase? Maybe that will be the theme of the second centenary of Teddy Roosevelt. Until then, I thank you for listening to me. I'll take any questions from anybody who would like to ask me. Anyone? Yes, you over there on the left. When was he born? Oh, where's Tweed? 1858, yes. October 27th, 1858. Well, what is today? Today's the 30th. We just missed his birthday, right? Or unless you were here for it. Yes? I'm concerned about the profession. I'm concerned by many developments and many different factors. I'm concerned by the charge of fake news. I'm concerned about the number of people who get their news from social media. Let me ask you, because we have a lot of young people here, how many get their news from an established newspaper like the New York Times, whether online or in print? Okay. How many get it from watching cable television? Okay. And how many get it from social media? So by far, social media is so we're at a real critical junction on that score, right? Because social media is a kind of Wild West. And so long as Mr. Zuckerberg says he's not a media provider, he's only a utility, I think we suffer the potential that news will be manipulated by algorithms. You all know this, right? So that we'll end up confirming biases, we'll end up with much more of the stretching of the truth, which comes, I think, from the use of those algorithms, and I think we'll be in a dangerous place. Now, is there good journalism being done today? Absolutely. There's fabulous journalism being done today. Can you find it in multiple places? Yes. Are we better informed? I'm not so sure. Do we have more opportunities to be informed? Yes, I think we do. Hope that answers the question. Yes, anybody else? Anybody else? Yes. The source in the work that they're doing, or you mean in the way that they apprehend sort of the? Okay, I'm old school on this, so I would suggest that they read the outlets that have earned the seal of trust. There's a lot that is published that is either derivative of someone else's work, and we all know through the childhood game of telephone how that can operate, and there's a lot that is completely unsourced and distorts the truth, right? So I would recommend that they have a daily diet of reading an established and reputable news source. But I would also say that if they can, they should read more than one, and that they should seek out diverse opinions, so they understand not only things from one point of view, but from another point of view, and it will help them understand each other more. And that's the last thing I would say. I would urge them to talk to each other, trade ideas. If freedom of speech means anything, it means the flow of ideas back and forth between people who feel free enough to say what they think. Informed opinion, yes, but opinion is so important that we challenge each other, that we speak to each other, that we not put up barriers to each other. Yes? I'm sorry, give me a foreign opinion and what? The staying objective. Well, I've run up against this consistently with my students at Mount Holyoke, who become very suspicious of anything they believe it inevitably shows the bias of the journalist, right? First off, there are signposts in most journalism that tells you what it is that is being done. An opinion page, an op-ed piece is definitely going to be an opinion. Straight journalism should not be driven by opinion, should be driven by facts. Does that mean does not have the point of view of the author there? No, absolutely it's got the point of view of the author, but it's informed by the facts in front of them. I actually am one of those people who believe that when Kellyanne Conway said alternative facts, it was actually enlightening, not something that's a laugh at. You have something, a perfect example is what happened this past weekend when al-Baghdadi was killed. And the Washington Post wrote a headline on his obituary that said, an austere religious scholar, a leader of ISIS, Baghdadi dies. Is he an austere religious scholar? Perhaps, but he's also more primarily a terrorist in chief, right? They changed the headline an hour later. Are both true? Yes. But what one do we want to apply in that moment? Probably the terrorist in chief over here, because that's more significant to his impact upon the world. Terrible impact upon the world. If you look at any news story and compare the headlines across 5 to 7 newspapers or news outlets or cable television, whatever it may be, you will see that there's a variety of ways to characterize it, all of which will be true. But the decision of the editors, the authors, in order to provide a particular perspective is not intended to develop bias or express bias. It's how they see the facts that are in front of them. And they see the facts, not opinion. Yes? That's a good question. By that you mean, am I a sort of reformer journalist? Yeah. I would say I'm not. I mean, my own particular career has been driven a lot by an historical perspective upon contemporary events. Are there people who serve as reformer journalists? Yes, there are many. We call them sort of advocacy journalism in some cases, people who adopt a particular issue as their focus. Again, I see nothing wrong with that, and it's not, I would not say it doesn't violate objectivity so long as it's clear, the writer's clear about their point of view, and they work from facts. Propaganda is the stretching and distorting of facts in order to achieve a particular result. That's something that we should not be reading, right? Because we cannot be informed by such a point of view. Yes? I can't quite hear you. Can you speak up a little bit? Who came back to like TR? Wow, what do you think of the particular moment? I don't know about the answer to that. Is Tweed here? I think he would be impressed by the stir of activity in the popular dialogue right now. I think he would be disappointed by the cynicism about government purpose. He was one of the first people to believe government as an agent for good, right? I mean, government as an activist role, and really went up against the Supreme Court in the interpretations of the Constitution at the time as to whether the American system allowed that kind of participation. I think you look at the sweep of the 20th century and probably have some doubts about the power of government to effectively address social problems, but he would probably, given his general optimistic nature, believe it still could be done. Someone else? Yes? I believe they do have that responsibility because of the mere size and the pervasive nature of social media. I believe particularly Facebook should have that. I think they have to realize at a certain point that they are no longer a utility if they are generating this quantity of information and people are looking to that for their own understanding of the world. Would there be exceptions? I think they'd have to develop a pretty sophisticated policy on how to deal with this. But they essentially would be doing the same thing that newspapers did 100 years ago, or magazines did 100 years ago, which is understanding the nature of whatever it is the communication is and framing it in a way that made it understandable to the reader, viewer, now, right? Yes? Well, the First Amendment prohibits government interference. It doesn't prohibit NBC News from determining how they're going to present a news story, right? Effectively, you would be asking Facebook to operate a little bit more like NBC News than to operate like a utility. So the First Amendment really is directed at prohibiting the power of government to interfere with the press. I don't think that I would call what I've suggested for Facebook regulation. I would suggest that it was a kind of, because I don't think the government would be in a position of actually telling Facebook what to do in terms of the content, but only that it needed to respond to its role in society. It's a very interesting question, really. I mean, there's another issue coming up before the New York State Legislature. Maybe you're aware of this, where I believe it actually will become law. Governor Cuomo said he'll sign it to have cable systems require them to offer local news, keep channels available for local news in their cable offerings, and that they're doing this in part because, you may know, local news is essentially evaporating. We are now without local journalism in many parts of the country. When the GM plant closed in Youngstown, Ohio, earlier this year, the newspaper folded a few weeks later. That's a city of 500,000 people. I mean, no local journalism there. I mean, they closed. They didn't just close their print operations. They closed their online presence also. This is a danger, where we know that where there's no journalism, corruption flourishes, right? So the interesting question there is, if government mandates that cable systems provide an outlet for local news, and that they in a sense, support it, right? And that they underwrite it, is that the interference of the government in violation of the First Amendment? It'll have to be debated, right? Other questions? Yes? Yeah, that's a good question. I think you develop, if you start doing what I'm going to describe, you develop a kind of sixth sense when you come to something. It is absolutely true that there are plenty of I would say, fake news sites, if you want to use that term, but sort of conspiracy or agenda-driven operations that masquerade as legitimate news operations. They'll adopt a logo that looks like a newspaper, old-fashioned newspaper logo, or there's even one that bought out, it was not abcnews.com, but something very close to ABC News, and masquerades itself as if it's ABC News, right? I think you have to develop a sense for what, first of all, you should have a palette of very solid news outlets that you can go to. And I would urge you to include in there one of the sort of legacy news operations like the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Boston Globe. These are all reputable news organizations. Even as you seek out other ways to find your news as well. I'm not saying we should reject the modern social media methods and also digital media methods in order to be able to just return to old-fashioned news gathering. But I think you can tell from the strident nature of the headlines, usually. You can tell from the way that stories are framed. Often the stories are framed with a purpose in mind, and you can detect that if you become a good consumer of journalism. I mean, I don't know whether this is true at LIU, but I know that at Stony Brook they offer, in fact, I think that it's a requirement for freshmen coming into college there that they take either civics or media literacy. And media literacy is meant to introduce you to how digital media frame and deliver the news in a way that will make you a better, more judicious consumer of news. It's not that far-fetched an idea. And if you go back through the history of communications, there's always a turbulent period in the beginning of an introduction of a new medium, the radio, the television, cable television, the internet. And when that happens, there's an adjustment period as consumers begin to understand what the new vocabulary is of the new medium. And once they do, they become more educated news viewers. And suddenly they know what radio's limits are and what its strengths are, what television's limits are and what its strengths are, the internet, the cable television, and now social media, right? The internet and social media. So I urge you to seek out those kinds of, that kind of skill building. Yes? No? Okay, I thought you had anybody else? Thank you so much. I really enjoyed being here. I appreciate all your time.